In today's tutorial, I want to go over a couple different ways that you can add textures to your animations. Now, I know I've talked about textures before, but there are a couple ways that I haven't mentioned. Now, before we get into the tutorial itself, I just want to say a quick thank you to today's video sponsor, Skillshare, but more about them later on. Anyways, we might as well hop straight into After Effects where we're going to be taking a look at the first method. And this one is something I haven't really used myself a whole bunch, but I've been loving it a lot recently. I don't think it gets used very much in general, but we'll start laying out our actual animation. So I'm just gonna start with a background and we can just create any sort of background really. I like a little bit of an off-white color, so like an F3, F3, F3. I think that just looks pretty good. And then we're gonna set up our text. And we're gonna keep this super simple. Let's just do like, comment, and subscribe because it's fun. And then I'm just gonna take my text and I'm just gonna center it up right here so it's center aligned and center that up. And I'm gonna change the font to something a little bit nicer than this. In this case, I want something that's pretty fun. Maybe this font, pretty good actually. Let me just up the quality of that a little bit. And then I'm gonna use Decompose Text, which is a free plugin, to separate the words individually. You don't have to do this, but for the sake of imitating the animation we did, that is how I did it. So I'm just gonna make sure that I enable approximate position because I just wanna be able to have the words on their own layers, and if you pick the original position, it'll be a little bit weird. So just make sure you pick that, and then we can delete our original layer. So now we can move our text around, and you can select all the layers actually, and just make sure you align layers to composition and just center all that up. And then we can maybe take him and just scale it down just a little bit so it's not so big. And let's position this around. So we're gonna start with like, comment, and we'll create a little bit of fun over here. So we'll just lay that out right there. Maybe rotate these just a little bit, just to make it a little bit more janky, a little bit more fun. And select all except for the end. And let's just kind of position it somewhat in the middle here. And then for the end text, what I did in the example that we saw, I took a rounded rectangle and I just drew around it a little bit. And let's remove the stroke from that and just give it a solid fill. In this case, let's do a black color. And then selecting our shape layer, I'm just gonna search for size, and then I'm gonna unlink it and just increase it until we get a shape that roughly covers it, and we can place it below the end. And let's change the color of the text to be the same as the background, so it kind of looks like almost a cutout. And then if you go into the shape layer again and just search for rounded, you can increase the roundedness of it so that we get a nice pill shape almost. I'm gonna go back into size and just increase that a little bit. You can select both layers, make sure you align it to composition and just center that up so we know that that is exactly where we want it to be. And then I'm gonna use Void, which again is a free plugin. I'm gonna use that so it creates a node that both of those layers are parented to, and then I'm just gonna scale it down using this and rotating it and moving it around, just because that is a little bit easier. And maybe even scale that down just a little bit more. So now we have that there, and what I did in the example itself was create just a little bit of more funness by changing each of these to be a different color, just to get a nice little bit of some nice vibrance in there. So just select each one and change it to a super bright color. And it truly, the crazier you go, the better it's gonna be. I'd keep it somewhat in the same realm. So if you're doing all bright colors, do all that. If you're doing pastel colors, do that. And then I like mixing and matching cool and warm colors. So we have red, which is a pretty warm color. And then I'll just take it and do a cool color next to it. And then down here, let's maybe do a greenish color. Contrast is super important, so you want to keep that in mind as well. Like this bright yellow obviously is very hard to read, so you can maybe drop it down a little bit so it's a bit more orangey, and then just decreasing the saturation or the luminance of that color to make it a little bit easier to see what we actually have going on here. And I'm just gonna hit U to hide everything, and I'm gonna take my end and my shape layer, all that, and put it at the very top. And we can just change the color of this to orange, just so we know that that's like a separate thing. Now we can go ahead and add some animation to this. So for the text, I just want to keep it super simple, and we're just going to add a scale animation. But before we do that, you can select all your layers pretty much, and then go in to Motion Tools, again, free plugin, and just center the anchor point, which is just gonna make sure that when we scale it up, it's gonna scale from the center instead of from the bottom, which is the typical with a text layer. So now we can just hit S on everything to open all of that up. And then for the end one, we're just gonna keyframe the void or the null, just because we don't need to keyframe the individual layers of it, and just set a keyframe for all of that, and then move that keyframe out a little bit. Let's go to about 1 second, and then right at the beginning we can just set all of that to 0. So now playing that back, we have a scale animation, and we might move this in a little bit closer, and then we're just going to add some sexy speed to make sure that our animation is nice and sexy. Just gives it a nice little bit of momentum right there. That is pretty much it for like the animation itself. You can add a little bit more flair, like for example to the end, if you hit Alt to open up the rotation, and then add an expression by Alt clicking the stopwatch, and then you can type in something like posterized time, which is going to slow down the animation a little bit, set it to something like 6, and then add a wiggle expression to something like 1,10, and that's just going to give us a nice little bit of wiggle on the rotation of that. So it just adds a little bit more movement. And for the other text layers, I might add the same expression, but just to the position value instead. So you can right click on the rotation with the expression and copy expression only, and then open up the position of the other layers. So I'll just Command V to paste that onto there. And now we should just have a nice little bit of movement in the text itself. So it's just gonna look a little bit more fun. And you can always adjust the wiggle parameter. You can hit double E with nothing selected to open up all your expressions. And then you can change the wiggle to something like, let's say 1,3 instead, which is then gonna decrease the amount that it moves. And if you want it to speed up, you can then increase the first parameter here to something like 15. So now it'll move a little bit faster and less position that it'll move each time. And then if you want to then do that for all of them, you can just copy the expression. And this time, since we copied it from the position parameter, if we just paste it onto the layers, it'll automatically go to the position one. If we would have done that with the rotation, it would have gone to the rotation instead. So now we just have this nice little bit of animation here, and that is pretty much it for this main bit. Now we can take all of this and let's pre-comp it and just name this text pre and hit enter. And then we can add another scale animation. So once this comes up like that, then we can hit S right here and keyframe the scale and go forward, and let's just zoom in a little bit like that and just add sexy speed. So now we get another little bit of movement in there. So it comes in and then again, and then what I did in the initial title animation that I did is what I added an optics compensation. And that's just gonna let you get a little bit of like a fisheye distorted lens. So you can see here how it kind of bends the text. And the closer it is to the top, the more distorted it gets. So if you increase this even more, for example, you can see it becomes more and more distorted. So that's something super fun you can play with. And you can always enable this to continuously rasterize, which is gonna keep all the quality of the layers because we are working with text and shapes. So it's the best to do it that way because otherwise it's going to become blurry for no reason. We might as well use it when we can. Now, as you can see, it does affect the background. Just delete the background for now, and then we'll add it later on when we've pre-comped all of this. For now, let's just do that and change the background of this to a white so we kind of get a sense of what it is that we are looking at. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can add texture, like actual overlay textures, or you can even add what I like to call visual texture, which is kind of what we did with the optics compensation. It's not really a texture in itself necessarily, but it does add some visual to it that I think can be classified as a texture. The position, the little expression we did, or the rotation expression, I would also classify as texture. So it's just about seeing it in different ways. But the technique that I actually want to show in this that I was talking about earlier is using an overlay texture in a bit of an interesting way to create some distressing in the text. So I'll go into my Finder window and I have a whole bunch of textures that we're going to use today. But the one I want to take a look at first is this one. You can see it looks pretty gray, but it's actually a bunch of black and white values. And it doesn't really matter, but you do want to make sure that it does have black and white values for this to work. And I'm just going to leave this above everything else, and then we are going to use that as a track matte. So now if I link that to my text to my track matte here, it doesn't really look like much is going on, but then if we change it to be a luma matte instead of an alpha matte, it'll look at the black and white values of that texture. And you can even go in and adjust it more by adding something like a curves or levels, and you'll see how that changes it. And essentially what we want here is just a nice separation between the black and the white values. So you can see the difference before and after. It looks less gray, has a bit more contrast. But we're gonna hide that for now. And I'm actually gonna scale this down because it's a little bit too big. And I just want just a little bit of texture. And then you can see how we get a little bit of like cutouts in the text. Whereas if you were to just use this as an overlay texture, it wouldn't really give you the same vibe. I'm also going to add a levels to this. I'm just going to decrease the whites a good bit so we get just a little bit less cutouts. So we just want a little bit of texture. It almost looks a little bit half-tony. But I really like this because it adds that distressing to the text. instead of just being an overlay texture. And I just feel like it gives it some different depth than what you would usually get if you were just to overlay the text itself. Now to the text itself, I want to add a different type of texture that I've talked about before, which is echo. And that's again one of the things I would like to classify as a visual texture. It's not a texture in the traditional sense, but it does give it a little bit more of a textured feel. I'm just going to set that to -0.001, increase the number of echoes, and then change it to composite in back or composite in front. It really depends on the type of look you're going for. In this case, it's not going to matter too much, but you can see the difference in the end. So in this case, we'll do composite in front because that looks a little bit better. And we might even increase this to something like 50 just so we get a nice bit of trail in there. Just a nice little bit of texture in there. It looks a little bit funky with the echo and then the little bit of motion that we have in the layers itself. So you can go in and turn that off, or even just keyframe the echo. So right here, when it kind of comes to end, you can just keyframe the echo time and the number of echoes. Hit U to bring up that, go 1, 2 frames forward, just a few frames, and just set both of those values to 0, and then you won't have that anymore. And you can add things like posterized time, which is another great way of adding some texture to it by slowing it down a little bit and make it feel a little bit more hand-drawn. And this is one of the things that I like doing, and I think is a way to separate your work, is adding a lot of different layers of textures. So don't only use one or the other, but combine them to create a cohesive look. But that is pretty much it for how I created that little bit. Of course, a couple more things you can add to it and spice it up. Now, before we get into the second way of adding some textures, which I'm looking very much forward to because it's super fun, I want to talk a little bit about Skillshare, which is also today's video sponsor. Depending on where you are in the world, summer is finally here, and that usually means that a lot of us have a lot more free time on our hands, whether you're in school or if you even got some summer vacation from work. That free time doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stop learning though. The summer is a great time to pick up a new skill. We have more daylight, which means more hours we can do stuff, and personally, I'm looking to develop a couple of skills in some unexpected areas. I very badly want to start a clothing brand, and to do that, I kind of need to know a little bit about that world. So I'm really looking forward to diving into the world of creating tech packs and learning how to design clothing in a way that actually makes sense other than just slapping things on mockups. Luckily, Skillshare has me covered. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives. They have pretty much anything you can imagine of, whether you're looking to learn how to make tech packs like myself, or if you're wanting to dive deeper into motion design, graphic design. You can even learn about cooking or business, which just makes the platform so great. You don't have to only learn about one thing. You can pick whichever you want, and you can even bounce between different things. Not only that, but you can always be confident in the quality. All the classes on Skillshare are taught by industry professionals, and you can rest assured that whoever's teaching that class knows what they're doing, and that information that you're going to be learning is going to be relevant when you get out into the real world. I highly recommend using the link below, which is going to give the first 500 people 1 month free of Skillshare to see what they have on the platform, figure out what you want to do. Now, if you want to do a little bit more about textures, learning how to make your own, and developing that skill set, there's actually a class I'd recommend for you. There's a class by Brad Woodward called Collect, Make, and Digitize, a guide to custom textures, which covers how to make your own textures. And I thought that would be super helpful in relation to this. And it's something I really enjoyed watching myself as someone who's working on building their own library of textures. But with that being said, I want to say thank you to Skillshare, and make sure you head to the link in the description where the first 500 people to sign up with that link can get 1 month free of Skillshare and explore a little bit around and make sure that their summer break is productive. Now with that being said, let's hop into the second technique. This one, there's really two ways that you can go about it. There's the super cool and hands-on way, which is a little bit more tedious, but will give you the best results. And there's also the cheating way. I'll make sure that I cover both for the sake of everyone that, you know, you might not have a printer and a scanner, but you still kind of want to look. One thing you do want to make sure of if you're doing it the tedious way, whether you want to do this with a video or an animation, is that whatever timeline you're working in, you want to decrease the frame rate. So in this example, if I hit Command K to bring up my composition settings, you can see I have it set to 12 frames. The reason I want to do this instead of using posterized time, for example, is because with posterized time, you're still going to have all the frames, except you're just going to have a bunch of duplicates. So to avoid that, we're just going to decrease it of the composition itself. We're just going to give the same look, but with less pictures once we export it. You can even drop it down to something like 6 if that works better for your specific animation or video. But in this case, I think 12 frames looks pretty good. And then I've just marked off this little section, which is just a ball coming, turning around, and it just cuts before it finishes out the animation. The reason I only want to do a short bit of this is this sequence alone is a good few frames, but I also think the transition between a digital animation and then going into a lot more hand crafted, like tangible textures looks super sick, and I really like the switch of the look, and it just adds a little bit of visual interest. We are gonna take this and we're just gonna export it as a PNG sequence, and it's super easy. You just go onto composition, go into add to render queue, and then open up your render settings. Like in the output module, you just wanna make sure that you select either JPEG sequence, PNG sequence, whatever you wanna do. In this case, I have a background, I'm just gonna keep it. So I'm just gonna select a JPEG sequence, and then we can pick where we wanna save it. With a location selected, I'm just gonna hit render, and then it's gonna render everything out, and we should get a nice little folder with a bunch of images. So if I go into my folder where I set to print it, we now have a beautiful 14 images that we're gonna print out. The easiest way to do this is using something like Google Docs or Pages if you're on Mac, or Word or something like that, and putting them all into a document. And what I want to do here is lay them out in a way that makes sense. And then I'm just going to do one by one so I can make sure that I know what image is what. You do want to keep the size of all of this the same, but don't go too small because then it's going to be super hard to work with. 6 to 8 on each page is going to be pretty good for a workable size. But I'm going to do all of this, and then I'm going to meet you over at the printer where we are going to finish this off. So with all of them printed out, we can start just having some fun with it. You can do whatever you want to it. I'm just gonna add a little bit of scratches here and there, add a little bit of pen strokes and whatnot. You just wanna have fun and make something that looks cool, and then also think about how it would look put all together. Think of it as a hand-drawn animation. Once we have all that sorted out, we just wanna go ahead and scan it like I've done, or you can even take a phone and just take pictures of each frame and then send it to your computer. I scanned them, airdropped them to my main computer, and then I just adjusted the colors a little bit in Photoshop to get the look that I want. Now we can go back into After Effects, and I have my 4 scans right here, and I'm just gonna drag them all into After Effects. And this is just gonna make it super easy to put together now that we have all these in here. So I'm just gonna start with the first one, and let's just solo the very first one. And essentially what we wanna do here is rotate it. We can just select them all actually and rotate it, and just rotate them 90 degrees. And now we just wanna scale them down, boop, 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 so we can see it in the screen here. And I'm just gonna make them a little bit smaller than what they actually have to be. And for this first one, we wanna crop out this first little frame here. So I'm just gonna select my rectangle tool, and I'm just gonna click and drag to cut that out. And we can rename this frame 1, duplicate it, and then we can unsolo it and move it over, and hit M to bring up our mask, click the mask path and just move that over to select frame 2. And we just wanna make sure that we do indeed have the full frame in here. So that looks pretty good. Let's just put it roughly around here. And then we can duplicate that. That'll be frame 3. Again, unsolo that, hit M to bring up the mask path, and let's just move it down in the corner over here. So it should roughly be close to where we need it. We just need to adjust it just a little bit like that. So now we have this cut out as well, and duplicate it again, unsolo that so we're only seeing frame 4, hit M to bring up the mask path and move it over this way, and let's center that up somewhat, make sure that is in. And we just want to repeat that process for all the frames, and once we have that, we can start laying them out and actually recreating the animation that we originally made. Now we have them all cut out so they are only 1 frame per layer, so we can take them all, and let's just go back to the very beginning, and then we're just going to hit Option and close bracket to just chop them at 1 frame, and we can move them forward to begin right where our marker started, because we know that is the sequence that we're working with. And then you can either use something like motion tools to stagger them in the correct order, or you can just do it manually. It's not too hard, but we're just gonna do that. Boom. And now we have an animation that looks like this. So let's play it back real quick. And we can already see how cool that looks with just the added bit of texture. But now let's open this up so we can see the full animation. So we have the regular animation, and then it cuts into that and then goes back into what the animation actually was. So we get a little bit of texture cut. Now we don't want all this white background here, so scale it up to match the edge of our canvas. You just want to go select your layer, you can hit Y to bring up your anchor point tool, and then you can move it to the center of whatever this is just to make it a little bit easier. But you just want to scale it up until you have it lined up pretty good. And it doesn't need to be perfect, you just want it to get pretty close. Sometimes if it's a little bit too perfect, you just lose a bit of the effect of having it being something hand-drawn, and it just gives it a natural wiggle almost, instead of adding it as like an adjustment layer later on. And just like that, we can now play it back, and we have the initial animation cuts into the textured one, and then we get the nice juicy little transition in there. And it just looks, I mean, You really can't go wrong with this look. It looks so beautiful, but there is a little bit of a way you can cheat it. We obviously won't be able to get as much texture in there as we have right here, but we can simulate it just a little bit. We'll just do that by, let's hide all of this so we can just see what it looks like without this animation. And the way we're gonna do this is just simply by adding a whole bunch of textures to this. I'm gonna open up my little project folder here and we're gonna add a whole bunch of them. So let's start with just a simple paper texture. And I'm gonna add that on top and just change that to multiply. And that'll just give us a nice foundational texture for, well, making it look like it was on paper actually. And you can see we get some super nice texture in there already. We can add an adjustment layer and I'm just gonna add a transform effect to it. And that's just simulate just a little bit of that jumping around that we got with the printed out one. And we'll just set the scale to something like 102 and then alt click the position of it, go down into the expression box that it's opening up, add a posterized time, set it something like 3 and then a wiggle 222,2. And that's just gonna give it, again, that little bit of wiggle in there. I already have a little bit of texture applied to the main circle itself. You can see in here I have a turbulent displace, but you might even want to crank that just a little bit, increase the amount of this just a little bit, just so we get a little bit more of it in there. Maybe decrease the size to something like 1, make it a little bit rougher. And then we're gonna use a bit of the technique that we used in the first example as well. We can take this texture right here and add it into, let's just take the main circle, and then we're gonna track matte it to that texture and change it to a Luma matte so we get some of that nice cutouts in there. Let's just scale this down a good bit just to fit the frame. And then we're gonna add a levels to this and just drop this down a good bit and increase that a little bit so we get just a little bit of that cutout in there. And you can see how that's already starting to look pretty good. We just want something that's pretty contrasty and just knocks out just a little bit of that. Then we can add some animated textures. I highly recommend making a bunch of these with textures that you use pretty often. I have some different particles. I have some different overlays that just make it super easy to add all of this to it. And I'd say let's add this poster texture in there as well. And what I've done is I've actually added the best blend mode in a bracket just to make it super easy when I add it or when I share it with people. Add that in there, maybe decrease the opacity of it just a little bit. And let's put that below the adjustment layer as well. You can always add a curves to this and adjust the look of it just a little bit. We can also add some more texture. So something like this maybe. We can take one of these. Let's add this one in there. Drag that in, and I'm just gonna solo this for now, and I'm gonna hit P, Shift R, Shift S to bring up the rotation, scale, and the position at the same time. Keyframe all of it, and then go forward a couple frames. Let's do 12 frames right here, and then just move it around a little bit. Boom, and this is just basic animating a texture, but we will use this to drive a displacement map. And then we can select them all, and then right click on them, and then go toggle hold keyframe. We can add a loop out expression if we want to loop it indefinitely. Just loop out and right click and copy expression only and just paste it right in there. And you can even go forward a couple frames and just copy and paste the first keyframe. And that, I've just found that usually works a little bit better. Just move that up. And sometimes you get a little bit of weirdness when you do this. So that copying and pasting those initial keyframes usually works the best. You can select all of them and then holding Alt, you can click and drag the keyframes to change the pacing of it, which is going to change the speed of it. So this is just a little bit faster. This is a little bit slower. And we just want something that's somewhat chaotic, but we can unhide that and unhide all of that. And then below our textures right here, we're going to add an adjustment layer, and let's add a displacement map. And we are going to select the texture fabric one that we just used, effects and masks. And let's just hide these textures for now so we can get a little bit of a better idea of what it is that we're actually doing. You can see it's already driving it just a little bit here. So without it and with it, and just move this around a little bit just to get a little bit more texture in there. Take the background, just increase it a little bit so we don't bleed on the edges. Another thing we can do is if we look at one of these frames, you can see that the color palette it looks a little bit more limited. There's some dithering going on, and we can simulate that just a little bit. Above our adjustment layer, I'm just gonna add another adjustment layer, and I'm gonna add an effect called posterize. Not posterize time, just posterize. And that's just gonna limit the amount of numbers in our composition. And that should give us some pretty cool looking colors in here. You can see how that just changes the way that the colors are being read. So a higher number means more colors, a lower number means fewer colors. So you just want to play around with this until you get some pretty cool texture in there. Something like that looks pretty cool. You might even increase it a little bit more to something like 8. Anyways, that is pretty much it for this tutorial. Just a few different ways that you can add some spice to your animations. My personal favorite is printing them out, scanning the mech in, and then adding them in. I just think it gives such a nice vibe break. You see it a lot in music videos, not much in animations, which we should do more of because it's sick. But with that being said, I just want to say thank you for watching. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. As always, you can head to the link in the description, sign up with them. First 500 people can get 1 month free to Skillshare and try that out, learn something new during the summer. You can also get the project files for all of this in the description below by heading to my Patreon, patreon.com/Mapal. And yeah, I hope you learned something new, hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll see you again next time. Peace out.